The searchlights were still raking the hills when the first 28-centimeter shells came in. Just after midnight on November 7, 1914, the Japanese batteries east of Kiaochou Bay fired by clockwork, each gun captain waiting on a red flash from the observation post, each concussion rolling over the trenches like a physical shove. On the skyline, the German forts around Tsingtao, Bismarck, Iltis, Moltke, answered with slower thunder. In the harbor behind them, hulks sat low at anchor, steam valves whispering, crews already damping fires. A mile out, the seaplane carrier Wakamiya lay to in the swell. Longboats bobbed beside her hull as ground crews manhandled canvas-winged Maurice Farmans into the water. Engines coughed alive. The pilots, helmets tied down, lifted off black water toward the town's searchlit outline with 4 small bombs strapped under each wing. 100 days earlier, this had been a busy treaty port with cobbled streets, stucco walls, and German street names, Kaiser Wilhelmstrasse, Prince Heinrichstrasse, laid out with the confidence of a power that expected to keep what it had taken. The Kaiser's government had leased the Bay of Kiaochou from the Qing in the 1890s and built a coaling station and naval harbor at Tsingtao, the East Asia Squadron's home. When war came in August 1914, the squadron's commander, Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee, took his cruisers to sea. They would make headlines across the Pacific and South Atlantic before dying off the Falklands. What von Spee left behind was a fortified enclave, heavy guns on the heights, mines in the bay, and a garrison of Marines, reservists, and sailors under Governor Alfred Meyer Waldeck, plus the Austro-Hungarian cruiser Kaiserin Elizabeth swung to her moorings with boilers warm. On August 15th, a Japanese ultimatum demanded Germany hand over the concession. 8 days later, Japan declared war, and Britain, bound to Japan by treaty, backed the move. The expedition's ground commander, Lieutenant General Kamio Mitsuomi, landed his 18th Division at Laoshan Bay in early September and began the careful work of siege, surveying the ground, dragging narrow-gauge rail forward for ammunition, and pushing saps and parallels toward the German lines. A small British contingent, including the 2nd Battalion South Wales Borderers and Indian troops with mountain guns, came up from Tientsin and Hong Kong to join the line. Off the coast, British and Japanese cruisers sealed the harbor. All the while, something new joined the war. On September 5th, the Wakamiya's seaplanes launched the first naval air raids in history, puddling into the bay and clawing skyward to drop hand-fused bombs on the forts, radio masts, and the small craft in Kiaochou's anchorages. The blast charges were light, accuracy poor, but messages went home with the pilots. The bombs burst where they fell, and men took cover on the ground. German flyers answered in kind. A Taube monoplane, flown by Lieutenant Gunther Pluschow, scouted Japanese positions, photographed trench lines from low altitudes, and tossed grenades over the side at ships in marching columns. He later claimed to have driven off a pursuing Japanese aircraft with a pistol. The details were disputed, but the idea that a sky could decide a ground fight was becoming real. The terrain made the logic of the siege plain. Behind the German wire, a ring of forts crowned the high ground, with Bismarck Hill the most critical. In front of them, the Japanese methodically dug forward. Each night, labor battalions shouldered bundles of pickets, coils of wire, and timber balks for gun emplacements. Each day, the engineers aligned the next trench by compass and white stake, the next sap by chalked line, and the big howitzers by theodolite. From mid-October, the besiegers brought up the same 28-centimeter weapons that had crushed Port Arthur a decade earlier, barrel-heavy machines that chewed crater after crater out of the German positions. The defenders answered with accurate counter-battery fire, shrapnel shells bursting over newly turned parapets, and riflemen catching working parties in the light of flares. Every few days, the sea reminded both sides that it was a front of its own. German torpedo boat S-90 slipped out of the harbor under rain and cloud on October 17th and put a fish into the Japanese cruiser Takachiho, sending her down with heavy loss of life before S-90 ran for neutral shores and scuttled. Mines struck Japanese destroyers more than once. On the defensive line, the loss stiffened resolve. In the bombardment parks, crews simply worked faster. By late October, the arc tightened. Prince Heinrich Hill fell. Batteries on the flanks went silent as breach crews were killed and ammunition spent. The Kaiserin Elizabeth and the remaining German gunboats joined the land fight, steaming into positions where they could throw shells inland. When the arithmetic turned against them, they opened their Kingston valves and slid under, fires drowned, flags still up. On November 6th, Cameo ordered the final set piece, an all-night bombardment to crush the last forts and then a dawn assault across the inner wire. Japanese and British infantry moved from traverses to assembly trenches, while the big guns lifted their aim in measured steps. The sky, already bruised by smoke, flashed in sheets as the Wakamiya's pilots made their last sorties, one plane damaged and forced down near the beaches, the rest returning with oil streaked across their windscreens. When the whistles blew, assault parties ran with wire cutters and Bangalore torpedoes. Scaling ladders followed, then the companies in file, hunched against shrapnel. They took Bismarck Hill with bayonet work through shell-torn earth and a battery position where gun barrels drooped at odd angles from heat. White flags appeared on parapets. A reserve company pressed through to the final crest and found German officers already burning maps. At dawn, Governor Meyer Waldeck sent out his staff to talk surrender. He had stretched the siege as long as he could to tie down Japanese forces and keep the colony's honor intact. Another hour of fire would bring only more dead. The terms were straightforward. The garrison would march out under guard, private property would be respected, public stores and armament surrendered. The Union Jack and the rising sun rose together over the government house. In the trenches, stretcher teams worked until their hands bled. For the attackers, casualties ran into the thousands over 2 months of digging and closing. For the defenders, losses were lower but final. Most of the German and Austrian prisoners, officers in their peaked caps, sailors still smelling of coal smoke, were shipped to camps in Japan, where many would spend the rest of the war making music, brewing beer, teaching language classes, and waiting for a peace that would take years to arrive. What made Tsingtao more than a tidy colonial episode was the way it condensed the coming century into a single operation. Trenches and barbed wire dictated distances and time. Monstrous howitzers, their steel stamped with factory marks, reduced fortresses systematically. Warships did not decide the issue alone, but without them, there would have been no blockade and no supply line. And above it all, fragile aircraft, fabric stretched over spruce and wire, added eyes and a new way to scare men who had never considered that danger could come from directly overhead. The siege was a preview reel of a world war that would bury itself from Flanders to Gallipoli. After the surrender, the flags stayed where they were. Japan took control of the port and the railway out to the Shandong interior, arguing that its alliance sacrifices had earned it Germany's leasehold. When the war ended in Europe, the treaties tried to make that claim permanent. Chinese students filled the streets of Beijing in 1919 to protest the transfer. The May 4th movement that followed reshaped Chinese politics for a generation. Only in 1922, under pressure at the Washington Naval Conference, did Japan return Tsingtao to Chinese administration, carrying away the memory of its first deep-water victory and a belief, hard to dislodge, that modern power lived at the intersection of industry, sea, and air. If you visit what is now Qingdao, the German street grid still sits beneath newer names. Brick villas with red roofs line leafy roads. A Lutheran church stands on a hill. Warehouses face a harbor working on different schedules. Somewhere under a landscaped park is the chalky, compacted soil of a trench line where British and Japanese soldiers shared cigarettes and argued about rations. Out past the breakwater, the water is the same dull blue it was on the nights when longboats pushed canvas machines into the bay, and men with oil-stained hands stepped onto their floats with bombs the size of anvils tied beneath their wings, inventing an air-sea battle before words existed to describe it. The siege was brief by the standards of the war that followed, and deadly enough for those who were there. It closed with a white flag lifted across shellfire and opened a century in which alliances would shift and technologies would climb out of laboratories into the open air. Japan and Britain stood together that autumn, the smoke of their guns mixing over a Chinese harbor built by Germans. A day later, the guns were silent, and the world kept moving, trench by trench, runway by runway, toward the future those nights foreshadowed. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.